Old Henry Hank Callahan, 85 years old, walked in, back slightly bent, steps slow but firm. His black cap rested proudly on his silver hair, stitched boldly with golden letters, U.S. Marine Corps veteran. The regulars barely lifted their heads. For most, Hank was just another old-timer sipping coffee, minding his own business. Before we continue, please do subscribe to my channel. Only a few of the older folks remembered that he used to own Mel's Roadhouse decades ago. Back when the jukebox played vinyl, not digital. Hank made his way to his usual corner seat, the one beneath the dusty Marine flag. He eased down with a quiet sigh, ordered a plain black coffee from the bartender, and gazed out the window, watching the world drift by. This was his moment of peace, the one afternoon he allowed himself to be still, surrounded by memories. But today something was different. The quiet hum of the room snapped as the door banged open, shaking the loose windows. Hank's fingers stilled on his mug. 3 bikers stormed in, boots thudding heavily against the old wooden floor. They smelled of gasoline and stale beer, their jackets rough with patches, none of them earned. The biggest of them, a man with a twisted grin and arms like tree trunks, scanned the room with a sneer that could curdle milk. "Look at Grandpa over there," the big biker chuckled, elbowing his buddy. "Think you still matter, old man?" Hank didn't flinch. He simply lifted his coffee, took a slow sip, and set it back down. His silence seemed to irritate them more. The biker swaggered over, standing tall over Hank's seated frame. "I'm talking to you, Grandpa Valor." The biker's voice turned sharp. "Think that cap makes you special? You ain't nothing but bones and stories." The room quieted, tension swirling like storm clouds. Hank's gaze remained steady, eyes calm like still water. He had seen worse. Jungles filled with bullets, deserts filled with explosions. This was nothing. But the biker didn't back down. With a quick slap, he knocked the coffee mug out of Hank's hands. It shattered against the floor, its hot liquid splattering Hank's boots. And then came the punch. The biker's fist landed square on Hank's cheek, snapping his head sideways. The force sent him tumbling off his stool, his thin frame hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The entire bar froze. Glasses stopped midair. Forks hovered above plates, and the jukebox fell silent. Not a soul moved. Not the bartender, who wiped a glass and pretended not to notice. Not the younger patrons, who buried their faces in their phones. Not even the 2 elderly men playing cards by the window. Hank lay on the ground, cheek bloodied, chest heaving. For a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath. The biker looked around with a proud smirk, flexing his knuckles. "No one's coming to save you, old man," he scoffed. But one person had already moved quietly behind the bar. With careful fingers, the bartender picked up the phone, dialing. A number stored deep in the back of his mind. His voice didn't quiver, nor did it rise above a whisper. "Captain Callahan," he said into the receiver. "It's about your father. You might want to come down to Mel's." While the bar pretended nothing happened, the bartender's quiet words traveled miles through the phone lines, reaching a secure base just outside the city. Captain Daniel Callahan, Hank's son, stood in the center of the operations room, his uniform pressed, his medals earned, and his voice commanding. His jaw clenched as he listened. "Understood," Daniel replied, calm yet cold. Within moments, boots shuffled, engines roared to life, and wheels crunched gravel. Convoy of military vehicles peeled out of the base, heading straight towards Mel's Roadhouse. The biker, meanwhile, gloated over Hank's fallen body, turning his back on the man he had just humiliated. 30 minutes later, the ground beneath the bar began to tremble, not from passing trucks, but from something heavier, something with purpose. Tires screeched to a halt outside the bar. Dozens of boots hit the pavement in synchronized rhythm. The door swung open once more, but this time, it wasn't a gang of bikers. It was a convoy led by a soldier with the same piercing eyes as Hank. Only younger, sharper, and carrying decades of military discipline in his stride. Captain Daniel Callahan stepped into the bar, his polished boots making sharp, deliberate clicks against the worn floorboards. Behind him, a dozen uniformed men and women followed, soldiers from his elite unit. Their faces expressionless, their posture rigid. The murmur of the bar instantly died, replaced by a choking silence. Daniel's sharp eyes scanned the room, but they didn't wander long. They locked directly on to the one man who mattered most in that moment. His father, Hank Callahan, still crumpled on the floor, one hand struggling to push himself up, blood tracing a path from his temple. Daniel's chest tightened, but his face remained steel. He marched across the floor, the line of soldiers forming behind him. The biker, who had returned to his beer after the assault, turned his head with a lazy smirk. "Well, what's this? Daddy's army coming to cry over some spilled coffee?" The biker jeered. Daniel crouched down, helping Hank into a seated position. His hands were gentle but firm, wiping the blood from his father's cheek. Hank, stubborn as ever, tried to shake it off. "I'm fine, Danny," Hank muttered. But Daniel shook his head, voice low and filled with a quiet fury. "No, Dad. Not today." Daniel straightened, his back ramrod straight, and fixed his gaze on the biker. His voice was calm. Too calm. "Which one of you assaulted a United States Marine veteran?" Daniel asked, his words slicing through the stale bar air. The big biker chuckled and stood up, chest puffed. "That'd be me," he said, cracking his knuckles. "And what are you going to do about it, soldier boy?" The other bikers snickered, but their laughter was shaky now, uncertain. Daniel took one step forward, the soldiers stepping in behind him like a shifting wall of discipline and strength. Without raising his voice, Daniel spoke. "You stand here with stolen patches, insulting a man who's bled for this country? My father didn't flinch when he faced enemy fire, and he sure won't flinch for a coward in a fake vest." The biker's smirk faltered. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, though he tried to maintain his tough stance. Daniel motioned with 2 fingers. One of his soldiers, a tall, muscular sergeant, walked up and grabbed the biker's leather vest. With swift precision, he peeled back one patch after another, revealing their fraudulent stitching. "Fake valor," Daniel announced grimly. "That's a federal offense." Murmurs rippled through the room as the bar patrons leaned in, realizing the man they had watched mock an old veteran wasn't even the soldier he pretended to be. Daniel didn't stop there. He pointed towards the security camera perched above the bar's entrance. "Sergeant Harris, pull the footage. We're documenting every second of this disgrace." The bartender, who had remained silent until now, spoke up, his voice edged with, "Shame. It's all on tape, Captain. No one here stopped it." No one stood up. Daniel's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. He turned briefly to the bartender and nodded. He did what mattered. "You called me." Meanwhile, the biker had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. He fumbled for excuses. It was just a joke, a bit of fun. "I didn't know he was your old man," the biker stammered. Daniel's voice lowered, becoming sharper, deadlier. "You didn't need to know. Should have known respect." His soldiers flanked the bikers, standing inches away, eyes hard as iron. Daniel walked back to Hank, helped him stand properly, and whispered, "We're going to make this right, Dad." Hank patted Daniel's shoulder weakly, his pride shining. Through the bruises, moments later, red and blue lights painted the dusty windows of Mel's Roadhouse. The sheriff's truck screeched to a halt outside. Through the door walked Sheriff Owens, a man with graying hair, wide shoulders, and a reputation for no-nonsense justice. "Captain Callahan," the sheriff greeted, eyeing the soldiers. Standing at attention, Sheriff Daniel nodded. "We've got an assault on a veteran and evidence of fraudulent military claims." Owens's jaw worked angrily as he walked straight to Hank. His eyes softened. "Hank. Damn, I'm sorry. This happened on my watch." "Okay." Hank gave a weak smile. "Not your fault, Owens. Some folks just forget their place." Turning to Daniel, the sheriff nodded. "You got footage?" Daniel pointed to Sergeant Harris, who was already transferring the video to a secure drive. "Perfect," Owens grunted. Then his eyes landed on the shrinking biker. "You like punching old war heroes, son?" Owens asked, voice as sharp as a whip. The biker's mouth opened, but no words came out. "Good," Owens barked. "Then you're going to enjoy explaining." This to a judge, and maybe spend some time learning real respect behind bars. As cuffs clicked onto the biker's wrists, the bar began to shift. People realized. Silence made them accomplices. The sheriff's deputies swiftly secured the three bikers, handcuffing them with practiced ease. The largest biker, the one who had thrown the punch, no longer laughed. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by nervous gulps and darting glances. Captain Daniel Callahan stood tall, his eyes never leaving the scene. His father, Hank, had been helped to a chair, a wet cloth pressed gently to his bruised cheek by a young soldier. The bar remained silent, no clinks of glasses, no idle chatter. Just the weight of guilt filling the air. Daniel took a step forward, addressing everyone. They all sat there. His voice was calm but cut through the room like a blade. While a man who served this country, who sacrificed more than any of you can imagine, got assaulted. No one met his gaze, Daniel continued. There was a time when men like my father walked into a bar and people stood up. Out of respect, bartender, voice cracking, whispered, "We forgot, Captain, we forgot." Daniel's eyes softened just a fraction, then sharpened again. Then today, we remember. Outside, the sheriff's deputies loaded the bikers into the cruisers, their heads lowered. Daniel turned back to Hank and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Justice had only begun. The soldiers didn't leave right away. They stood guard, a silent reminder of the price of disrespect. Daniel gave orders in clipped tones. Secure the video evidence. I want it on record this happened, and I want it to go through the right channels. Sergeant Harris saluted. Yes, sir. Daniel leaned down to Hank. Let's get you to the hospital, Dad. We need to get that cheek checked. Cheek checked. Hank shook his head stubbornly, gripping Daniel's wrist. Not yet. I want to walk out of here on my own 2 feet. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Together, father and son rose. Hank's steps were shaky but determined as they made their way toward the door. The patrons, once indifferent, now stood from their seats, creating a quiet path for Hank to walk through. Someone whispered, "Thank you for your service," and others echoed it. By the time Hank stepped outside, the quiet murmur had turned into something deeper, respect. The soldiers stood at attention as the captain and his father walked through their ranks. The sheriff gave Hank a nod of admiration before tipping his hat. "See you soon, Hank. Next time your coffee's on me." Hank gave a tired smile. "You're damn right it is." The engines of the military convoy roared back to life, shaking the dusty road. Hank was gently helped into a Humvee, Daniel sliding in beside him. The young soldiers saluted as their captain passed. The sheriff's vehicle followed, escorting the arrested bikers back to town. Inside the Humvee, Daniel glanced sideways at his father. "You shouldn't have had to go through this." Hank shrugged, wincing slightly. "Son, I've been through worse. What hurts more?" Was the silence. No one spoke up. Daniel's jaw tensed. That silence ends now. As they drove, Daniel made a quick call to the local Veterans Council. News of the incident began to ripple through the town. Phones buzzed, messages spread, and before they even reached the hospital, half the community had already heard what had transpired at Mel's Roadhouse. Daniel's men worked quickly, compiling the footage, gathering statements, and contacting the right officials. The bikers wouldn't just face assault charges, they'd face exposure for stolen valor. A crime the veteran community didn't forgive easily. Daniel sat back, exhaling slowly. Justice would come. But something more important had begun. An awakening by nightfall. Hank was resting comfortably in a hospital bed, his cheek bruised but spirits intact. The room was quiet, except for the occasional beep of the monitor. Daniel sat beside him, rolling his stiff shoulders after a long day. A knock came at the door before it opened. Sheriff Owens stepped inside, followed by a few familiar faces. The bartender, the cook from Mel's, and 2 regular patrons. They shuffled in awkwardly, hats in hands, eyes lowered. We came to apologize, Hank," the bartender said, his voice thick with shame. "We should have done something, but we didn't." Hank, tired but still the man of discipline, slowly sat up straighter. His voice, though soft, carried weight. You all had a choice, and you froze. That happens. But what matters is what you do next. Daniel folded his arms, watching quietly. The sheriff added, "Word spread. Hank, people are talking. Folks are ashamed. They want to make it." "Right." Hank looked around, eyes clear despite the swelling. "And make sure no veteran walks into that bar, or anywhere else in this town, feeling invisible again." Heads nodded, guilt turning into resolve. The next morning, the sun rose over a town that felt different. It wasn't just a regular Thursday anymore. Mel's Roadhouse had cleaned up the broken glass, but the memory of the previous day still lingered in every corner. A hand-painted sign now hung at the entrance. "Veterans always welcome. Coffee's free for heroes." Inside, the usual clatter was quieter, more thoughtful. People whispered about Hank, about the bikers, about how no one stood up, and how they wouldn't make that mistake again at the sheriff's office. The bikers sat behind steel bars. The biggest one, bruised from a swift and forceful arrest, now wore an orange jumpsuit instead of his fraudulent biker vest. Sheriff Owens stood outside their cell, arms folded, slight grimace of disgust on his face. "Judges don't like folks who pick on old war heroes," the sheriff said flatly, "and they like stolen valor even less. You're going to spend some time thinking about your choices." The biker looked away, shame overtaking his bravado. His fists remained clenched, but it was no longer in pride. It was in regret. Meanwhile, Daniel stood on the courthouse steps, meeting with town officials. He wasn't done, not yet. Inside the courthouse, Daniel stood firm, facing the mayor, few council members, and leaders from local organizations. His words were calm, but filled with conviction. "This wasn't just about my father," Daniel began. "This was about how we, as a town, treat the men and women who wore the uniform." The mayor, a stout man with a thoughtful expression, nodded slowly. "You're right, Captain. We've grown too quiet, too passive. That stops today." Daniel continued, "We need to do more than just punish the guilty. We need to honor the worthy. There are veterans in this town eating alone, living forgotten. We have a duty to change that." One councilwoman raised her hand. "What are you proposing?" Daniel outlined his idea, a community program honoring veterans every month. Discounts at local businesses, mentorship programs for younger kids to learn about service and restoring. The old memorial park. By the end of the meeting, the mayor agreed. "Consider it done." First event, this weekend. Daniel shook hands with each person before leaving. Justice wasn't just locking up the bikers. It was waking up a community, and it was working. Back at the hospital, Hank watched the news play on the small television. Mounted on the wall, his name flashed across the screen, followed by clips of soldiers marching into Mel's Roadhouse. Caption read, "Veteran assaulted in bar. Town responds with honor." He shook his head in disbelief. "Well, didn't expect to be famous at 8:05, he mumbled. Daniel entered, carrying 2 coffees, one for himself and one for Hank. Specially made how his father liked it. Strong, no sugar, just like the Marines. Looks like you. "Stirred up the town, Dad," Daniel said, handing him the cup. Hank took a grateful sip. "Nah, you did. I just fell off a stool." Daniel smiled faintly. The town needed a reminder. A nurse came in, cheerful and smiling. "Mr. Callahan, you've got visitors. A lot of them." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Really didn't know I had that many friends." Within minutes, old war buddies, neighbors, young kids from the local ROTC program, and even strangers filed in to shake Hank's hand, offer thanks, and simply show respect. Daniel stood in the corner, arms crossed, heart full. His father was finally getting the honor he'd always deserved. That weekend, the town gathered for a special event at Memorial Park. A fresh banner was raised. Veterans Appreciation Day, honoring service, demanding respect. Daniel stood on stage beside the mayor and Sheriff Owens. While Hank sat front row, eyes gleaming beneath his veteran cap, the mayor spoke first, addressing the large crowd. "This week we were reminded that freedom comes with a cost. And those who paid that cost deserve more than silence. They deserve respect." Applause echoed across the park. Daniel stepped up next. His voice was strong, commanding. My father is a hero, not because he was assaulted, but because every day, for decades, he carried himself with dignity while the world forgot. Now it won't happen again. Not here. The crowd roared. Hank stood slowly, cane in hand, and raised his coffee cup. I didn't ask for this, he said, voice hoarse but firm. But I appreciate it. All I ever wanted was a good cup of coffee and a little respect. Today, I got both. Laughter mixed with applause, and a new tradition was born, one built on honor, respect, and a vow to never stay silent again. And for the first time in a long while, Hank felt truly seen. Days turned into weeks, but the effects of that one. Afternoon at Mel's Roadhouse rippled far beyond the bar's dusty walls. Local newspapers printed front-page stories, and television anchors replayed the confrontation again and again. Hank Callahan became a symbol not just of resilience, but of quiet dignity. But not everyone moved on easily. Inside the county jail, the main biker, known around town as Crusher, sat with his head lowered. He'd been tough on the outside, full of noise and muscle, but inside, things felt different now. His lawyer visited with grim updates. You're facing assault charges, theft of valor charges, and a judge who's personally connected to the veterans group, the lawyer said plainly. Crusher grimaced. It was just a punch, didn't? No, the old man was. The lawyer cut him off. Ignorance isn't a defense when it comes to respect. Meanwhile, Daniel met privately with Sheriff Owens and the town's judge, Judge Tillman, a Vietnam veteran himself. Daniel pushed for something unusual. Justice, yes, but also redemption. We don't just want punishment, Daniel explained. We want change. Judge Tillman leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. I think I know exactly how to handle this, he said with a slight smile. Court day arrived quickly. The courtroom was packed. Townspeople, veterans, reporters, and even students from the local high school's civics class filled the benches. Hank sat quietly near the front, flanked by fellow veterans, each one wearing their service caps. With pride, Crusher shuffled in, his tough guy persona replaced by nervous glances. His buddies followed, equally Mr. Hawkins. Judge Tillman addressed Crusher by his real name. You disrespected not just a man, but what he stood for. Crusher swallowed hard. Under normal circumstances, Tillman continued, I'd throw the book at you. Assault on an elderly veteran and stolen valor. You'd be gone for years. Crusher's shoulders sagged, but the judge said, voice shifting, Captain Callahan made an unusual request, to give you a second chance. Courtroom stirred with whispers. Hank's eyes narrowed slightly, watching carefully. The judge explained, you will serve jail time. But when you're done, you will report directly to the Veterans Outreach Program. You'll scrub memorial plaques, repair headstones, listen to veterans' stories, and every week, you'll personally serve coffee to the heroes you mocked. Silence fell before quiet. Approving nods filled the room. Crusher blinked in shock, unsure how to respond. The idea of listening to old war stories, fixing memorials, and serving coffee seemed worse than jail in some ways. It meant facing the people he had mocked. Daily. Judge Tillman leaned forward. You'll learn who these men and women are. You'll understand the sacrifices you disrespected. And maybe you'll come out better. Daniel stood and faced the courtroom. This isn't just about my father. This is about setting things right in our community. We don't solve problems by ignoring them. We confront them, we fix them. Hank, though still bruised, smiled faintly as court adjourned. Reporters swarmed Daniel and Hank, asking questions about justice and forgiveness. Daniel kept his answer simple. Accountability teaches fear. Respect teaches pride. We chose pride. Outside, the town buzzed. Local businesses updated signs offering discounts to veterans. Schools planned assemblies about service and honor. The community once asleep was awake, and Hank, leaning on his cane, simply whispered to his son, "You done good, kid." Daniel's throat tightened, emotions swirling. Not just me, Dad, but all of us. Weeks later, Hank returned to Mel's Roadhouse, this time walking in with steadier steps. The bar was transformed, cleaner, brighter, and above all, respectful. Photos lined the walls. Fresh flowers sat beneath a memorial plaque, and the old, dusty marine flag was replaced with a freshly folded one. Crusher, now clean-shaven and humbled, stood behind the bar, wearing a veteran's outreach apron. The sight amused Hank. "Coffee, Hank?" Crusher asked, his voice steady but polite. Hank grinned. "Black." "Like my soul," he joked. Chuckles rippled through the bar. Crusher poured the coffee, placed it carefully before Hank, and added softly, "Thank you for what you did for this country, and for giving me a second chance." Hank met his eyes. "Studying the sincerity, respect's earned," Hank replied, taking a slow sip. "Looks like you're finally starting to earn it." Daniel sat nearby, watching his father be treated like the hero he was. Justice had been served, not just in court, but in hearts and minds. And as the town gathered again, Hank leaned back in his chair, peaceful, knowing that respect has finally come home. The transformation in the small town didn't end at Mel's Roadhouse. Word spread like wildfire across neighboring counties. Other towns took notice. Articles were written, interviews recorded, and Hank Callahan, once a quiet regular, became a symbol of a forgotten generation being rediscovered. Daniel watched it unfold with a quiet satisfaction. He didn't chase attention, but seeing young people approach his father to shake his hand, hearing kids recite the Pledge of Allegiance with pride, it meant the world. One afternoon, Daniel sat with Hank on the old park bench near Memorial. Hank's hands rested on his cane, his gaze on the freshly cleaned veteran plaques. "You realize you've started something bigger than you know," Daniel said with a grin. Hank chuckled. "Started something? Son, I just wanted a cup of coffee without being punched in the face." Daniel laughed too, but then his expression grew thoughtful. "Respect. It's not given by law. It's built by people willing to speak up." Hank nodded slowly. "And sometimes it just takes one person to remind everyone else." In the distance, the Veterans Outreach Group gathered, young volunteers scrubbing old gravestones, repainting fences, and listening to stories of service. Redemption was in the air. Crusher, now better known by his real name, Blake Hawkins, spent every morning at the outreach center. His tasks weren't glamorous, hauling supplies, mopping floors, and taking veterans to appointments, but each day slowly chipped away at the hardened cell he'd built around himself. One afternoon, after helping an elderly Navy veteran fix his broken fence, Blake found himself sitting at Mel's with Hank, sharing a quiet meal. "Didn't think I'd be back here. At least, not like this," Blake muttered. Hank, stirring his coffee, gave a slow grin. "Funny thing about life, it's real good at humbling fools." Blake lowered his head. "I didn't know any better back then. That's the point." Hank replied, "You didn't want to know. You never looked past your own anger, but you're changing that now." Blake swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I'm sorry, Hank. I mean it." Hank reached out, gripping Blake's shoulder with surprising strength. "Don't tell me. Show me every day." Blake nodded firmly, and from that day forward, he did just that. Every task, every gesture, every act of kindness built a path toward redemption. The town noticed, and slowly, even forgiveness began to take root. Months passed, and Veterans Appreciation Day became a regular celebration, bigger with each gathering. Families brought their children, veterans shared their stories, and the community grew tighter. Daniel, though busy with his military duties, made time to return whenever he could. Standing proudly by his father's side, the media occasionally stopped by, but the real magic wasn't in headlines. It was in the simple moments, the high school football team visiting the Veterans Center, the town's youth learning about real heroes, and old soldiers who once felt forgotten, now surrounded by gratitude. One bright Saturday morning, Blake stood in front of a crowd at Memorial Park, holding a microphone with shaky hands. "I was the guy who mocked a hero. I was ignorant, angry, and selfish," he admitted, his voice steady. But people here didn't just punish me, they taught me. They showed me what honor looks like. Blake turned toward Hank and saluted. I'm a better man today because this town didn't let me stay lost. Applause thundered through the crowd. Hank's eyes misted slightly, though he quickly blamed it on the sun. Daniel stood in the back, heart swelling with pride, knowing that change was alive and growing. As the ceremony ended, Hank took slow steps toward the newly unveiled section of the park, a tribute wall lined with photographs of local heroes, young and old. At the center stood a bronze plaque, etched with words that stirred every soul who read it. Respect is not just remembering the fallen, it's honoring the living. Hank traced the edges with his fingers, swallowing emotion. Around him, people mingled, laughter and stories filling the air. Daniel approached from behind, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. You proud, old man? Daniel teased gently. Hank smiled. Proud. I'm grateful. Grateful to see people wake up. To know that this country hasn't forgotten what's important. Daniel nodded, standing beside him. He reminded them. You stood your ground. Hank let out a soft breath, feeling peace settle in his chest. I stood my ground, and this time people stood with me. In that moment, Hank realized his quiet fight had blossomed into something much greater, a town healed, a generation educated, and respect restored. The fight had begun with a single punch, but it ended with a community rising to its feet. Life settled into a new rhythm. Roadhouse thrived as a welcoming spot, not just for locals, but for traveling veterans who heard of the story and stopped by. Hank became a living legend, the quiet hero who sparked a town's awakening every Wednesday afternoon without fail. Hank would take his familiar seat by the window, his black coffee served before he even asked. Blake, now a full-time volunteer with the outreach program, handled the morning shift, making sure the old Marine's cup was always full. On one particular afternoon, Daniel joined him, home on leave. The bar was unusually quiet as they sipped their coffee together, watching the world outside. You really turned this place around, Dad, Daniel said with pride. Hank shook his head with a warm chuckle. No, son. The town turned itself around. Sometimes people just need a little nudge to remember who they are. Daniel leaned back in his chair, admiring his father's calm wisdom. Well, that nudge came with a right hook. Hank laughed. Yeah, still feel it in my jaw. They toasted their coffee cups in a quiet, unspoken understanding. Respect wasn't something you asked for, it was something you earned, and sometimes something you reminded others of. The sheriff paid them a visit that day, tipping his hat as he strolled in. Afternoon, Hank. Captain, Sheriff, Daniel greeted, offering a handshake. Got some good news, Owen said with a grin. The town council voted unanimously. Memorial Park's expansion is happening. And he paused. They're naming the new wing after you, Hank. Odd. The old Marine blinked in surprise, his weathered hands tightening around his mug. Me? That's too much. Nope, Owens replied. It's not enough, but it's a start. The Hank Callahan Veterans Pavilion. Dedication ceremony next month. Daniel beamed. That's long overdue. Owens nodded. Word's gotten around. Veterans from across the state are coming. It's turned into something bigger than any of us expected. Hank sighed deeply, the weight of a lifetime of quiet service lifting from his shoulders. I never asked for recognition, Sheriff. Just wanted a good place to drink my coffee. Owens smiled back. And you'll have it, along with a whole community that'll never forget who you are. That day, Hank realized his story was no longer just his. It belonged to every man and woman who had ever been overlooked, to every forgotten sacrifice, and to every act of courage that had once gone unseen. As the weeks passed, Daniel worked closely with local leaders to organize the dedication ceremony. Soldiers from his unit volunteered to assist, helping prepare the grounds, install plaques, and ensure everything was ready. Local businesses sponsored the event, schools prepared performances, and veterans the entire town buzzed with anticipation. At home, Hank polished his boots and pressed his Marine Corps shirt, insisting he wouldn't be wheeled in, but would walk tall and proud. Daniel honored that, arranging for a quiet spot in the front for Hank to sit after the ceremony, the night before the event. Daniel sat beside Hank on the porch, sipping iced tea under the stars. "Tomorrow's about more than just me, isn't it?" Hank asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "It's about every veteran who was forgotten. Every service member who deserved more," he just reminded people. Hank smiled, eyes glinting under the moonlight. "Funny. All my life I tried to blend in. Never thought my quiet cup of coffee would stir up this much." Daniel placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You taught an entire town how to stand up again." Hank's heart swelled, humbled yet proud. The morning of the dedication arrived bright and clear. Flags waved proudly in the summer breeze, and the town gathered in numbers not seen in years. Uniforms old and new dotted the crowd, generations of service standing together. Daniel led Hank through the crowd, soldiers parting to make way for the old Marine. Applause erupted as Hank reached the stage, his steps slow but unbroken. The mayor stood ready, along with Sheriff Owens, Blake, and dozens of honored guests. Daniel took the microphone, his voice filled with pride. "Today we don't just honor my father. We honor every man and woman who wore the uniform, who protected this land, and who asked for nothing in return but respect." Cheers filled the air. The mayor unveiled the plaque, shining bronze against white marble. The Hank Callahan Veterans Pavilion, a place of honor, reflection, and respect. Hank stood silently, overwhelmed, as the crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Blake, standing nearby, wiped away a stray tear, knowing he had once been part of the problem, but now stood in the light of redemption. In that moment, Hank Callahan became more than just a man. After the ceremony, people lingered in the pavilion, walking through the photo exhibits, reading engraved names, and sharing quiet moments of reflection. Hank, though exhausted, sat comfortably in a shaded seat. Watching generations mingle, young cadets speaking to elderly veterans, children asking about medals, neighbors reconnecting, Blake approached, hesitant but determined. In his hands, he held something small, a carefully folded certificate with a ribbon. "Mr. Callahan," Blake said softly, "I wanted you to have this." Hank unfolded it slowly, his brows lifting as he read aloud. "Certificate of Lifetime Honorary Membership. Veterans Outreach Program." Blake smiled nervously. "You reminded me what it means to serve, not just in uniform, but in life. You gave me a second chance. This is my way of saying thank you." Hank's throat tightened. His gruff voice softened. "You've come a long way, son. Keep walking that road." Blake nodded. "I will." Daniel, standing nearby, caught the exchange. Pride swelled in his chest. Not every battle was fought overseas. Some battles were fought in small towns, in quiet hearts where respect could either fade or be reignited. That day, Daniel saw proof that even broken communities could mend if just one person stood tall. The news of the dedication ceremony spread across state lines, reaching military networks, veteran associations, and media outlets. Nationwide, messages flooded in: letters from strangers, calls from old service buddies, emails from military families who felt inspired. Daniel sat at Hank's kitchen table later that week, helping him read through the letters. "Listen to this one," Daniel said, reading from a handwritten note. "Dear Mr. Callahan, I'm a retired Air Force mechanic. After seeing your story, I decided to visit the grave of an old friend I hadn't seen in years. Thank you for reminding me what matters." Hank blinked hard, the corners of his eyes moistening. "I never thought sitting quietly in a bar could mean so much." Daniel smiled. "You didn't just sit, you endured with quiet strength. And when it mattered, you stood taller than the rest." Local schools invited Hank to speak to students. Mel's Roadhouse started a weekly veterans table tradition. The town's identity evolved, no longer a place of silence, but a place of honor, and Daniel knew this was only the beginning. Small towns could rise, old values could return. One man's quiet dignity could echo louder than any punch ever thrown. Months later, during a crisp autumn evening, Hank stood once again at Memorial Park, staring at the golden leaves swirling around the pavilion that now bore his name. Daniel stood beside him, dressed in uniform, preparing to return to duty. Hank sighed contentedly.
Hank sighed.
Coning out like this, Daniel nodded. Life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. Lake approached a line of young volunteers following him, teenagers from local schools. Learning about service by helping maintain the memorial, we're keeping it spotless, Hank, Blake said with a grin. These kids are learning the history. Firsthand, Hank smiled, heart full. Good. Keep em learning. Keep em remembering. Daniel placed a firm hand on Hank's shoulder. This is legacy, Dad, not medals, not speeches. Real change. Hank looked around at the younger generation bustling through the park, restoring, remembering, respecting, and he knew Daniel was right. I'll hold down the fort here while you're gone, Hank said, pride in his voice. Daniel chuckled. I never doubted it. Beneath the clear sky, father and son stood side by side, proof that respect, once forgotten, could be rebuilt, stronger than ever before, as the evening sun dipped below the horizon. Casting a warm amber glow over the small town, Hank took a final look around the pavilion. The air was crisp, filled with life, voices of people who had learned from his quiet example. Daniel prepared to leave the next morning, but he left reassured, knowing the town wouldn't forget again. Back at Mel's Roadhouse, a new plaque had been mounted near the entrance. It read, "In this bar, respect is not optional. Every cup of coffee tells a story, listen well." Blake ran the morning shifts, veterans gathered every week, young people listened, and Hank enjoyed his coffee in peace, surrounded by a community that had woken up to its better self. And somewhere, in quiet corners of the country, other towns began to stir too, inspired by a simple story of one veteran, one unjust punch, and a powerful lesson. It didn't take grand speeches or political debates. Sometimes it just took one man, quietly standing his ground. And from that, an entire community remembered how to stand with him. For Hank Callahan, it was never about fame. It was always about one thing, respect. And now, it would never be forgotten in the end.